when I found my father's old wooden box hidden under a loose floorboard in the garage rafters. I didn't know it would end with my sister standing in my glass studio wearing white gloves printed with the words "fraud fragile," polishing Depression-era glass under a court order while visitors watched. I didn't know I would be the one handing out postcards with her perjury conviction on the back, or that every afternoon at 2 o'clock she would clock in for her community service like a factory worker on an assembly line of shame. But that box, and the 5 words my father wrote inside it, set everything in motion. They were the first domino in a chain that collapsed her entire life, and I was the one who pushed it. My name is Elaine, and for 22 years I taught ceramics at a community college in central Ohio. Nothing fancy, just wheel throwing and kiln firing, showing 18-year-olds how to wedge clay until the air bubbles were gone, and how to center a lump of wet earth on a spinning wheelhead without it flying across the room. I paid my bills on time, lived in a small house with a porch swing, and drove the same Honda Accord for 14 years. My father, Harold, had one obsession: Depression-era glass. The colored stuff, the carnival glass with its iridescent sheen, the pale green uranium pieces that glowed eerie neon under a black light. He collected it piece by piece for over 40 years, driving his old pickup to estate sales in rural Ohio, waking up at 4 in the morning to bid at auctions, trading with other collectors at swap meets where the coffee was weak and the handshakes were firm. He kept a handwritten inventory in a green spiral notebook, every piece dated and priced and sourced, with a tiny Polaroid taped next to each entry. When he got sick last fall, pancreatic cancer that moved fast and took him from diagnosis to hospice in just under 4 months, my sister Patricia flew in from Chicago with her husband Mark. Patricia was the executor of his estate. She was a corporate attorney, the kind who wore blazers with shoulder pads and referred to herself as a brand in casual conversation. Mark was in commercial real estate, always on his phone, always talking about cap rates and triple net leases like he was reciting scripture. They stayed at a Hampton Inn near the interstate, not at the house. Patricia said the guest bedroom mattress was too soft for her back, and the water pressure in the shower gave her a headache. I didn't argue. I was too busy sitting by Dad's bed, holding his hand, watching the morphine drip regulate his breathing. Dad died on a Thursday morning in November. His hand was in mine, and his eyes were closed, and the last thing I said to him was that I would take care of the glass. He couldn't respond, but his fingers twitched just a little, and I chose to believe it was acknowledgement. Patricia was in the hallway on a conference call about a merger, her voice a low corporate murmur through the door. The funeral was Monday, a small service at the Methodist church where Dad had been a deacon for 30 years. I gave the eulogy. Patricia sat in the front pew and checked her phone twice. By Tuesday afternoon, she and Mark were at Dad's house with a laptop, a portable scanner, and a stack of file folders, doing what Patricia called taking care of things. I was still in the fog of grief, the kind where you forget to eat lunch and then realize it's 10 o'clock at night and you haven't turned on any lights. I walked through Dad's kitchen, running my fingers along the countertops he had built himself in 1987, and that's when I noticed the trash can by the back door. It was overflowing. Patricia had been cleaning out the garage, which apparently meant throwing away anything that looked old or dusty without opening it. On top of the pile, sitting on a crumpled bag of potting soil, was an old wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of pine, stained dark, with a hinged lid and a rusted brass latch. It was the kind of box that holds index cards, the kind people used before computers to store recipes or addresses. It was covered in 40 years of garage dust, gray and gritty, with a spider web in one corner. I pulled it out. The latch was rusted shut. Patricia saw me holding it from the kitchen doorway and said, "Oh, that's just junk. Dad kept old receipts in there from the 80s. Toss it. I already cleared the important stuff." Her voice was dismissive, the kind of voice you use when you're talking to a child who's picked up a dead bug. I said I would take care of it. I put it in my car in the passenger seat, and I drove home with it like it was a passenger. That night, alone in my house with the heat turned low and a cup of chamomile tea going cold on the coffee table, I pried the latch open with a flathead screwdriver from my pottery toolkit. The metal was so corroded it left orange flakes on my fingers. Inside were not receipts. Inside were letters. Maybe 20 of them, folded in thirds, each one tucked into its own envelope dated in my father's handwriting. All of them were addressed to me, Elaine written in blue ballpoint pen on the front of each envelope. I sat on my living room floor, my back against the couch, and I read them in chronological order. The first few were gentle, almost conversational. Memories from my childhood, the time he taught me to ride a bike on the gravel road behind the house, the day I made my first ceramic bowl in high school art class, and he put it on the mantel next to his favorite carnival glass pitcher. There was a letter about his own father, a railroad worker who died of black lung, and a reminder to check the brake fluid in my car every oil change because mechanics cheat. Then the tone shifted. About halfway through the stack, the letters became warnings. Patricia had visited him 3 times in the spring, always with legal documents and a stenographer's smile. She had asked him to sign a revised will. She had asked him to transfer the deed of the house into a trust she controlled. She had told him the glass collection was worth maybe a few $1,000s, that she knew a dealer who could take it off his hands for a fair price, that it was just old dusty knickknacks anyway. Dad had refused. The third-to-last letter ended with a line I have memorized, a line that is burned into my brain like a brand. Do not trust your sister. She will try to take everything. Save yourself and save the glass. The final letter was short, just a paragraph. It said, I put these in a box she'll never look at. If you're reading this, you found it. I'm sorry I couldn't stop her while I was alive. But you can. You're smarter than her, Elaine. You always were. I read that line 3 times, my hands shaking, tears dripping onto the paper and smudging the ink. I hadn't cried at the funeral, but I cried on that floor. Not from grief alone, from a strange, steel-boned sense of purpose. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always surfaces, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. Now back to what happened next. 2 days after the funeral, Patricia sat me down at Dad's kitchen table. She had arranged the chairs so she was sitting with her back to the window, the morning light behind her, making it hard for me to see her face clearly. She told me she had found a note in his desk drawer. A sale agreement, she said, handwritten by Dad, dated 3 weeks before his death. According to this note, Dad had sold his entire Depression-era glass collection to a private museum in Pennsylvania called the Heritage Museum of American Craft for the sum of $1. Patricia said she was legally obligated to honor the agreement as executor. She had already contacted the museum. They were sending a truck the following Monday. She showed me the note. It was a slip of paper, maybe 4 inches by 6 inches, torn from a notepad, with 2 sentences, scrawled in what looked like Dad's handwriting. I agree to sell my complete glass collection to the Heritage Museum of American Craft for the sum of $1,000, signed Harold Bennett. I stared at it. The signature was close, but something was off. The downward stroke of the H was too sharp, the loop on the B too tight. My father's handwriting had a relaxed, rolling quality, like waves on a lake. This had sharp edges, but I didn't react. I didn't say a word. I looked up at Patricia with the most confused, sad expression I could muster and said, "Oh, I didn't know he did that." Patricia nodded sympathetically. She said Dad must have wanted the glass to be in a place where people could appreciate it, that he probably didn't want it to become a burden on the family. She said $1 was just a formality, a legal way to transfer ownership. I said, okay, if that's what Dad wanted. I made my voice soft and breathy. I let my hands tremble on the table. Patricia reached across and put her arm around me and said, "You don't need to worry about any of this. Just let me handle everything. You've been through so much." Her tone was the kind of false warmth you'd use on a stray dog before calling animal control. That was the moment I decided to play weak. I knew from the letters that Dad had not signed that note. I knew Patricia had forged it. The timing didn't add up either. 3 weeks before his death, he could barely hold a spoon, let alone a pen with that level of control. But I had no proof, and she had all the legal machinery. So I became exactly what she expected me to be. A confused, fragile, middle-aged woman who needed taking care of. When Patricia suggested I move into their guest house in Chicago while I grieved, to be around family, I said yes. When she handed me a document to sign, waiving my right to contest the executor's decisions, I stared at it blankly and said I needed a few days to think about it. I was just so tired. My head was so cloudy, maybe after the weekend. Patricia smiled at me the way you smile at a slow child. "Of course. Take your time, sweetie." The guest house was a converted 2-car garage behind their main house in a gated suburb of Chicago called Oak Brook. It had a kitchenette with a mini-fridge that hummed too loud, a pull-out couch that sagged in the middle, and a picture window with a view of their heated pool, which had a fountain shaped like a lion's head. I moved in with 2 suitcases and the wooden box of letters, which I hid inside a hollowed-out pottery wheel I had brought from my studio. The wheel was a Brent model, heavy and solid, and I removed the wheelhead and stuffed the box inside the cavity, then replaced the head and covered the whole thing with a canvas drop cloth. Patricia and Mark thought I was bringing my hobby to keep me occupied, a therapeutic project for the grieving sister. They didn't think to look inside a 40-pound piece of pottery equipment. The first week in that guest house, I kept my head down. I nodded through dinners in their formal dining room, where Patricia talked endlessly about how stressful probate was, how complicated Dad's finances were, how many calls she had to make to the county recorder's office, how she was doing all this work for free because she loved her family. She said it so often it became a mantra, a shield against any question. I pushed food around my plate and smiled weakly. I listened to Mark take phone calls at all hours, pacing in the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropping to a whisper whenever he mentioned numbers. I noticed things. A week after the museum truck supposedly hauled away the glass collection, Patricia bought a new Lexus LS 500, pearl white with a buttery leather interior that smelled like a handbag store. She told me it was a lease. I saw the purchase agreement on the kitchen counter one morning when she was in the shower, and it was not a lease. The down payment was $40,000. Mark mentioned something about a balloon payment on a commercial property in Naperville, a strip mall they owned through an LLC that was coming due at the end of the month, and he didn't know how they were going to cover it. I overheard Patricia on the phone with someone at the museum, her voice bright and corporate, saying, "The donation paperwork is all in order. I'll have the tax receipt for you by Friday." Donation, not sale, donation. Museums don't pay sales tax on donations. Donors get tax write-offs. A $1 sale would not generate a tax receipt worth anything. But a donation of a collection appraised at $300,000, which is what the museum's paperwork would show, would generate a massive federal and state tax deduction. I started keeping a notebook of my own. A small spiral-bound pocket notebook I bought at a Walgreens, filled with cryptic shorthand. Dates, times, fragments of conversation. Aug 14, Pat, donation paperwork, tax receipt by Fry. Aug 15, Mark, balloon payment Naperville, $, due end month. Aug 17, Lexus dealer call, down PMT $40K. The fog in my head was clearing, replaced by a cold, methodical alertness. I started exploring the main house whenever Patricia and Mark were both out, which was often. They both worked long hours, Patricia at her firm downtown and Mark at his real estate office in Oak Brook, and they rarely came home before 7. I had a key to the main house, supposedly so I could use the laundry room. What I was actually doing was mapping their lives. The office door on the second floor was locked. It was a standard interior door, hollow core, with a basic Schlage privacy lock set, the kind you can unlock from the outside with a small flathead screwdriver. But I didn't want to leave a scratch, so I needed a more elegant solution. I knew how to pick locks. When I was 22, before I went to college, I worked for 2 years as an apprentice locksmith at Frank's Key and Lock on the south side of Chicago. Frank was a wiry man in his 70s with a nicotine-stained mustache and hands that never stopped moving. He taught me how to pick pin tumbler locks by feel, how to rekey cylinders, how to impression a key from a blank using a file and a vise. He taught me that every lock is a puzzle with a limited number of possible solutions, and that patience and a light touch will open more doors than a sledgehammer ever could. I still had my old pick set in a leather case, buried at the bottom of my toolbox, which I had brought with me from Ohio along with my pottery supplies. It was a basic set: a tension wrench, a short hook, a diamond pick, a rake. They were a little rusty, but I cleaned them with steel wool and a drop of 3-in-1 oil from the garage. The next day, when Patricia and Mark were out, I knelt in front of the office door. The lock was a 5-pin tumbler, worn smooth from years of use. I inserted the tension wrench, applied gentle clockwise pressure, and started working the pins with the hook. The first pin set with a soft click, then the second. The third was stubborn, a security pin with a spool shape that caught on the shear line, but I remembered Frank's voice in my head. "Ease up on the tension, let the pin talk to you." I eased up and the spool pin settled. The fourth and fifth clicked into place within a minute. I turned the tension wrench, the plug rotated, and the door swung open. It took me just under 3 minutes. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I stepped inside. The office was a study in controlled chaos. Mark's side had stacks of real estate listings, a multi-line phone, and a framed motivational poster that said hustle. Patricia's side had a large mahogany desk, a leather chair, and a 4-drawer filing cabinet next to a window that overlooked the pool. The filing cabinet was locked with a wafer tumbler lock, the kind found on cheap office furniture. That one took almost 6 minutes because the wafers were sticky, and I had to rake them twice. When the drawer slid open, the first thing I saw was a hanging folder labeled Estate Bennett Herald. I pulled it out. Inside was a formal donation agreement between Patricia Bennett and the Heritage Museum of American Craft, signed by Patricia as executor, appraising the glass collection at $300,000. There was a letter from the museum's acquisitions department, dated 2 weeks after Dad's death, thanking Patricia for her generous contribution to our permanent collection. There was a photocopy of the $1 sale note, the forgery, attached to a provenance waiver that stated the collection had been lawfully acquired from the estate. The museum had accepted the note as proof of legal transfer. They had no reason to question it. Patricia had used the fake sale to bypass probate entirely. As executor, she could transfer the collection to herself with a nominal dollar note, then donate it in her own name, taking the full $300,000 tax deduction on her personal return. It was elegant in its simplicity, and it relied on one assumption, that nobody would look too closely. I took photos of everything with my phone, every page, every signature, every letterhead. I made sure the images were sharp, that the text was readable. Then I put everything back exactly where I found it, relocked the filing cabinet, relocked the office door, and walked back to the guest house on legs that felt like rubber. That night, I lay on the pull-out couch and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Dad had written. Save yourself and save the glass. I was going to do both, but I needed an ally. I needed someone who could read the financial language I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, I told Patricia I needed to go back to Ohio for a few days to check on Dad's house and pick up some of my teaching materials. She was happy to see me leave. I could see relief in her eyes. She offered to book me a flight. I told her I preferred to drive. It helped clear my head. I drove 6 hours east on I-70, through the flat farmlands of Indiana and into the rolling hills of Ohio, and I went straight to Dad's house, which was sitting empty and cold. The grass was overgrown and the mail was piling up. I let myself in with my key, went to his study, and found his green spiral inventory notebook in the desk drawer where he always kept it. Every piece of glass had an entry: manufacturer, pattern, color, date of acquisition, purchase price, condition notes, and a small Polaroid photograph taped next to the description with yellowed Scotch tape. There were 237 pieces. Total purchase value over 40 years was about $43,000. But the current appraised value, based on a professional appraisal Dad had commissioned 2 years ago from a certified antique glass appraiser in Columbus named Arthur Fenwick, was $265,000. Arthur's report was in the drawer too, in a manila envelope, with detailed photographs and market comparables. I took the notebook, the appraisal, and every piece of financial documentation I could find, including Dad's bank statements, tax returns, and the original will that Patricia had supposedly revised. Then I drove to the office of a forensic accountant I found through the Ohio State Bar Association's referral service. Her name was Margaret Chen. Margaret was in her mid-60s, with silver hair cut in a precise bob, glasses on a chain, and the calm, unflappable demeanor of someone who has spent decades unraveling Ponzi schemes and divorcing spouses who hide assets in Caribbean shell companies. She worked out of a converted Victorian house in Delaware, Ohio, and her office was lined with bookshelves filled with tax code volumes and forensic accounting manuals. I laid everything out on her conference table: the letters, the forged note, the donation paperwork, the tax implications, the casual mentions of a balloon payment and a new Lexus. Margaret spent 3 hours going through the documents with a yellow legal pad, making notes and cross-referencing dates. When she finished, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Your sister has committed at least 4 felonies. Forgery, fraud, perjury on the estate tax filings if she filed them under penalty of perjury, and grand larceny." The collection is physically gone, but the paper trail is very much alive, and paper trails are where I live. She agreed to take the case, and she brought in a probate attorney named David Okonkwo, a man in his 40s with a quiet intensity and a reputation for bulldog litigation. David filed an emergency motion in probate court to freeze Patricia's executor authority and subpoena the museum's provenance records. The museum, to their credit, cooperated immediately. They were horrified at the implication that their collection included stolen property, and their legal department overnighted the full provenance file via courier. Inside were the donation agreement, the museum's own independent appraisal that confirmed the $300,000 valuation, which was actually conservative, the transfer paperwork, and, critically, the original of the $1 sale note. The original note was still attached to the provenance waiver, and now I could hold it in my hands, the physical artifact of a crime. This is where my ceramics background became unexpectedly useful. I'd spent 22 years teaching students how to mix glazes, which is essentially applied chemistry. The raw materials of ceramic glazes are metal oxides, cobalt oxide for blue, copper oxide for green, iron oxide for brown. The binder that holds glaze particles together before firing is gum arabic, a natural resin that dries to a hard, transparent film. Over the years, I had learned a lot about the chemistry of pigments and binders because I had to troubleshoot student work constantly. Why a glaze was crawling, why a color was fading, why a batch was flaking off the B-square. One of the things I learned, almost accidentally, was how different inks age. Old ballpoint pen ink, the kind used in the Papermate Lubriglide pens Dad bought by the box, is oil-based with synthetic dyes that oxidize over time and fluoresce a dull yellow-brown under ultraviolet light. Modern gel pen ink, the kind found in every office supply store since about 2010, is water-based with pigment suspensions that fluoresce bright white-blue under UV. The difference is immediate and definitive. I asked David to have the note examined by a forensic document analyst. He contacted a lab in Columbus that specialized in question document examination for the state attorney general's office. The analyst's report came back in 5 days, and it was devastating. The ink on the $1 sale note was standard gel pen ink, manufactured no earlier than 2019. My father had used the same brand of ballpoint pen, a Papermate Lubriglide with a medium blue cartridge, since 1982. He bought them in bulk from a stationery catalog and stored them in his desk drawer. And every letter, every check, every handwritten label in his glass collection notebook was written with that exact pen. He never owned a gel pen in his life. I had a letter he wrote me in 1991, and the ink on that letter matched the ink on the letters from his final months, both in color and chemical composition. The gel pen ink on the sale note was completely different, easily distinguished under a microscope, and confirmed by thin-layer chromatography. Additionally, the pressure patterns on the note, examined under a stereo microscope, showed hesitation marks. Tiny tremors and stop-start points where the forger had paused, trying to mimic an elderly man's shaky handwriting. My father's actual handwriting, even during his last weeks when he was on morphine, was smooth and confident. The strokes were continuous, the pressure consistent. The analyst concluded the note was a forgery with a confidence level of over 99%. The probate judge, a woman named Judge Harriet Mills who had been on the bench for 18 years and had a low tolerance for estate fraud, was not amused. I attended the hearing in Columbus, sitting in the gallery while David argued the motion. Patricia was not present. Her attorney, a high-priced Chicago lawyer she'd hired at the last minute, tried to argue that the note was genuine and that the ink analysis was junk science. Judge Mills read the analyst's report in silence, flipped through the 47 pages of Margaret's forensic accounting breakdown, and then issued her ruling. She voided the sale note, froze Patricia's assets including the tax refund she was expecting, and directed the museum to return the entire collection to the estate immediately. The museum complied within the week. David arranged for a specialized art transport company, one that had experience shipping fragile antiques for Sotheby's, to pack and ship all 237 pieces back to Ohio. They arrived in foam-lined wooden crates, each piece individually wrapped in acid-free tissue and suspended in custom-cut foam inserts. I stood in Dad's living room as the crates were unloaded by 2 men in white gloves and I cried. Not the kind of crying I'd done on my living room floor, but a quiet, exhausted, overwhelming relief. The glass was home, but the legal process was not over. Margaret had been digging into Patricia's finances for weeks, and what she found was worse than I had imagined. Patricia and Mark were drowning in debt. The commercial property in Naperville was underwater by almost $500,000. Mark's real estate firm had lost 3 major clients in the past year, and his income had dropped by 70%. The house in Oak Brook had been refinanced 3 times in 5 years, and the adjustable-rate mortgage was about to reset to a payment they could not afford. They had maxed out 6 credit cards, taken out a home equity line of credit that was fully drawn, and had a private loan from a high-interest lender that was due in 90 days. The $300,000 tax deduction from the museum donation was not a bonus. It was a lifeline, the only thing standing between them and financial collapse. They had planned the forgery meticulously, timing it so that the donation would land in the tax year when their other losses peaked, offsetting a massive capital gains event from a real estate sale they had done badly. And they had done something else, something that made my stomach turn. They had taken out a loan against Dad's house, the house Patricia was supposedly taking care of, using a forged power of attorney that she had backdated to a date 6 weeks before Dad's death, when he was already in hospice and unresponsive. The loan was for $80,000, secured by the house, and the paperwork showed Patricia's signature as attorney-in-fact for Harold Bennett. Margaret found the loan documents in a file labeled Home Equity Access, buried in Patricia's office cabinet. Patricia had not even bothered to hide it well. She was so confident in her ability to manage me that she had left the evidence in a locked drawer she assumed I could never open. The cruelty moment came a week before the final court hearing. I was still staying in the guest house, still playing the role of the confused, grieving sister. Patricia still thought I knew nothing. She still treated me like a piece of furniture. I had arranged with David and Margaret to gather one final piece of evidence, a recording of Patricia admitting to the forgery, or at least revealing her knowledge of the fraud. Ohio is a one-party consent state for audio recording, meaning only one party to a conversation needs to consent to the recording. That party was me. I wore a small digital recorder in my jacket pocket, a Sony ICD series, the kind journalists use. I had tested it, and the microphone picked up voices clearly even through a layer of cotton. I walked into the main house around 3 in the afternoon, when I knew Patricia would be home. I found her in the kitchen, standing at the granite island, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was tight and angry, the kind of voice she used when she thought no one was listening. She was talking to Mark, and I heard her say, "I don't care what the lender says. Tell them the house is in probate and they'll get their money when it closes. Just stall them." She hung up abruptly when she saw me. I took a breath. I told her I had been feeling unwell all day, dizzy and lightheaded, and that I had a sharp pain in my chest that was radiating down my left arm. I said I thought I might be having a heart attack. I leaned against the counter, my hand on my sternum, and I asked if she could drive me to urgent care. The clinic was 10 minutes away. Patricia looked at me with flat, empty eyes and said, "I have a conference call in 10 minutes, Elaine. Take an Uber." I said, "Patricia, I think this is serious. I'm scared." She sighed heavily, looked at her watch, and then said, "If you die, can you do it after I fix this mess with the estate? I can't deal with another body right now. I'm already handling Dad's, and that's been a paperwork nightmare." She said it with a casual venom, like she was talking about a broken dishwasher. Then she walked past me, opened a drawer, pulled out a document, and said, "Actually, since you're here, sign this. I've been waiting for weeks and I'm out of patience." It was the waiver I had been stalling on, the one that would waive my right to contest her executor decisions. She shoved the paper toward me across the island. "Sign it and then you can collapse on your own time." I stared at her for a long moment. The recorder in my pocket was capturing every word. I said, "Patricia, I know about the forgery." She froze. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions. Surprise, calculation, then a smooth mask of confusion. "What forgery? What are you talking about?" I said, "The $1 sale note. The museum sent over the original. The ink is from a gel pen manufactured in 2020. Dad died in 2023, but he hadn't used a gel pen in his entire life. The forensic document analyst confirmed it's a forgery, and the pressure patterns show hesitation marks consistent with someone copying an unfamiliar signature." I spoke calmly, clearly, as if I were explaining glaze chemistry to a student. Patricia stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed, not a real laugh, a sharp, brittle sound like glass breaking. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're a pottery teacher, Elaine. A pottery teacher who lives in a tiny house and drives a junker and has never done anything important in her life. You think you can figure out a legal document? You think you can outsmart me?" She took a step toward me, her hand reaching for the papers I had pulled from my bag. The forensic report, the letters from Dad, the photos I had taken of her filing cabinet. I stepped back and said, "Don't touch me. The authorities are already involved. The probate court, the IRS, the Ohio Attorney General's office. There's a warrant for your financial records and your tax filings for the last 5 years. I'm not alone in this, Patricia. I have a forensic accountant, a probate attorney, and a judge who doesn't like being lied to." She stopped, her face drained of color. She said, "You wouldn't, you're bluffing." I said, "I already did. I've been recording this conversation, and everything you said about the estate and Dad is now evidence. The cars, the loan against the house, the credit cards, it's all in the report. You're going to lose everything." Then I walked out of the kitchen, out the front door, and to my car, where I drove to a hotel near the courthouse in Columbus. David and Margaret were waiting there with a conference room full of files and a plan for the next day's hearing. The final hearing was in probate court, Judge Mills presiding. Patricia showed up with her attorney, looking pale and disheveled. She tried to argue that the sale note was a misunderstanding, that Dad had verbally agreed to the donation, that I was a disgruntled sibling making false accusations out of jealousy. Judge Mills listened for about 15 minutes. Then she introduced the forensic evidence. The document analyst testified by video link, walking the court through the ink analysis, the pen type, the hesitation marks. Margaret presented her accounting report, a meticulous 47-page document that traced every fraudulent transaction, from the forged power of attorney to the tax deduction to the undisclosed offshore account Patricia had been moving money into through a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. The recording I made in the kitchen was played in open court. Everyone in the room heard Patricia's voice, clear as a bell, saying, "If you die, can you do it after I fix this mess with the estate? I can't deal with another body right now." I watched the judge's face. Her expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster on her notepad. When the recording ended, Patricia's attorney tried to object on the basis of relevance, but Judge Mills overruled him. She said, "I think this goes directly to the question of the executor's good faith and fiduciary duty, counselor." That was the moment I knew we had won. In the end, the ruling was comprehensive and absolute. Patricia was removed as executor. A neutral third-party administrator was appointed to handle the estate. The loan against Dad's house was voided, and the lender was ordered to remove the lien. The tax deduction was reversed, and a full referral was sent to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division for tax fraud. The collection was ordered returned to the estate in full, and I was named its legal custodian and eventual owner after the probate process was complete. Patricia was charged with forgery, fraud, perjury, aggravated theft, and conspiracy. Mark was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and filing false financial documents. 6 months later, after a series of plea negotiations that went nowhere because the evidence was so overwhelming, Patricia accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to forgery and felony fraud. The perjury and theft charges were dropped as part of the deal, but she received 5 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of the $80,000 loan, and a permanent felony conviction on her record that disbarred her from practicing law in the state of Illinois. Mark took a separate deal, pleading guilty to conspiracy and receiving 3 years probation and a 5-year suspension of his real estate license. Their house in Oak Brook was foreclosed on within 3 months. The Lexus was repossessed. The Naperville Strip Mall went into receivership. The offshore account was frozen and eventually seized by the IRS. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Schaumburg, and Mark got a job managing a storage unit facility. I used my portion of the estate, along with a small inheritance from my father's life insurance policy that Patricia had not been able to touch, to buy a small commercial storefront in the Arts District of Columbus, on High Street. It was a former print shop with exposed brick walls and large front windows. I renovated it into a glass studio and gallery. The front room is bright and clean, with custom display cases lit by LED strips that make the carnival glass shimmer in rainbows. The collection is all there, all 237 pieces, correctly labeled with their history and provenance, and a plaque on the wall tells Dad's story. How a quiet man from Ohio spent 40 years finding beauty in fragile things. The back room is a working studio where I teach classes in glass handling, preservation, and the history of Depression-era craftsmanship. I retired from the community college and now teach full-time at the studio. I call it Shattered Trust Glass Studio because the name is true in more ways than one. The community service portion of Patricia's sentence was assigned by a judge with a deeply developed sense of poetic justice. After reviewing the case details and learning about the studio, she ordered that Patricia's 200 hours of community service be served at Shattered Trust. Specifically, Patricia is required to polish the entire collection. Every piece, by hand, using a microfiber cloth and a specialized non-abrasive cleaning solution approved by the American Institute for Conservation. She must wear white cotton gloves during the polishing. And the gloves, which I had custom-made from a medical supply company, have a phrase printed on the back of each hand in dark red lettering, in a font reminiscent of a museum label. Fraud Fragile. She clocks in every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 o'clock, signs a logbook, and sits at a table in the center of the gallery while visitors watch. She polishes for 2 hours at a time, and she is not allowed to leave until every piece assigned to her that day is spotless. I don't speak to her. I don't make eye contact. I just watch and remember the sound of her voice saying she couldn't deal with another body. Visitors to the studio receive a complimentary postcard at the front desk. The front of the postcard features a high-resolution photograph of the most valuable piece in the collection, a rare emerald green uranium glass vase from 1932 that glows like a jungle under black light. The back of the postcard has a brief factual statement about the case. It reads, "This collection was the subject of a probate fraud case in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, case number 2023 PR 004872. The executor of the estate was convicted of forgery and felony fraud after attempting to donate the collection to a museum under false pretenses. The collection was recovered and is now housed in the studio. The individual polishing the glass today is serving court-ordered community service as part of her sentence." Below that is the public docket information and the date of the conviction. It is not editorializing. It is not cruel. It is simply the truth, printed on cardstock, available for free next to a donation jar that benefits a local legal aid society that helps elderly people protect their estates from predatory family members. People take the postcards. Some of them read them and look over at Patricia with a quiet, dawning recognition. Some of them drop a few dollars in the jar. Some of them ask me questions, and I answer them honestly. The truth, after all, is what started all of this. My father knew what was coming. In his last months, weak from chemotherapy and sleeping in a hospital bed in his study, he sat up late at night and wrote letters to me by the light of a desk lamp. He hid them in a box that looked like junk, a box he knew Patricia would overlook because she had never once in her life looked at something old and dusty and seen value. He could not stop her from forging that note, but he could arm me with the knowledge I needed to fight back. He knew I would find the box. He knew I would read every word. He knew I would not let her win. He was a quiet man who collected fragile things made of glass and light, and he understood better than anyone that the truth does not shatter. It waits. It endures. And when the light hits it at the right angle, it reveals everything. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you believe that patience and paperwork can bring down even the slickest schemer, hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.